William stood at the mahogany door of his childhood home, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the brass doorknob. The familiar weight of the keys felt foreign in his palm after 3 years away. The colonial-style house on Elm Street looked exactly the same, with its white shutters and manicured lawn, but everything else had changed. His mother had while he was deployed overseas, and today would be his first meeting with his new stepfather, and the woman who had taken his father's place in his mother's heart. The sound of raised voices stopped him before he could turn the key. Through the thick wooden door, he could hear his wife Victoria's sharp tone cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. Her voice carried the familiar edge that had grown sharper over the months leading up to his deployment. Behind her harsh words, he could detect another voice, softer, more measured, trying to calm the situation. This had to be Rose, the woman his mother had mentioned in her letters. The housekeeper who had become more like family during the difficult transition period after his father's death. Pressed his ear closer to the door, trying to make sense of the heated exchange. Victoria's words were becoming clearer now, each syllable dripping with contempt and barely contained rage. She was berating someone about the proper way to serve tea, her voice rising to a pitch that made his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. This was the same tone she used when she felt her authority was being questioned, the same voice that had driven away 3 different housekeepers before his deployment. "I don't care how Mrs. Williams likes it done," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the superiority she had perfected during their brief marriage. "I am Mrs. Williams now, and you will follow my instructions exactly as I give them to you. Do you understand me, girl?" The silence that followed was deafening. Could picture the scene unfolding inside Victoria standing with her hands on her hips, her hair perfectly styled even at home, her designer clothes immaculate despite the hostile confrontation. She had always been beautiful, strikingly so, but there was a coldness behind her green eyes that had taken him months to recognize. By then, he was already committed to the marriage, trapped by his own sense of duty and the expectations of both their families. Rose's response came quietly, barely audible through the heavy door. "Yes, ma'am, I understand, but Mrs. Elizabeth has been feeling poorly today and the doctor said she should avoid too much caffeine. Perhaps some herbal tea would be better for her condition." The suggestion was met with a sharp laugh that made wince. He recognized that sound. It was the laugh Victoria used when she felt someone beneath her station had dared to offer an opinion. It was the same laugh she had used with their previous housekeeper, and with the young waitress at their wedding reception who had accidentally spilled water on the white tablecloth. "Are you questioning my judgment?" Victoria's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Are you telling me that a maid knows better than I do what's good for my husband's mother? Who do you think you are to contradict me in my own home?" Felt his jaw clench at the possessive way she said, "my own home." This was his childhood home, the place where his father had built a successful law practice and raised a family. His mother Elizabeth had lived here for 30 years, had planted every rose bush in the garden and chosen every piece of furniture with care and love. For Victoria to claim ownership so completely, so dismissively of his mother's feelings, revealed everything he needed to know about how things had been going in his absence. The sound of footsteps approaching the door made him step back quickly. He fumbled with his keys, making enough noise to announce his presence before pushing the door open. The scene that greeted him was exactly what he had imagined, but somehow worse in reality than in his mind's eye. Victoria stood in the center of the spacious living room, her posture rigid with authority and barely controlled anger. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored slacks that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled as if she was expecting a photographer to arrive at any moment. But it was her expression that stopped him cold, the cruel satisfaction in her eyes as she stared down at the woman standing quietly near the antique tea service. Rose was everything Victoria was not. Where Victoria was tall and angular, Rose was petite and curved. Where Victoria's hair was styled to perfection, Rose's dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that emphasized her warm brown eyes and gentle features. She wore a simple blue dress with a white apron, practical shoes, and no jewelry except for a small silver cross around her neck. There was dignity in her posture despite the obvious harassment she was enduring, a quiet strength that reminded him of his mother. Victoria's voice changed completely when she saw him, becoming breathy and sweet, the voice she used when she wanted something. She rushed toward him with her arms outstretched, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "Darling, you're home. Why didn't you call? I would have prepared something special for your arrival." He accepted her embrace mechanically, his eyes still on Rose, who had stepped back respectfully but was watching the reunion with careful attention. There was something protective in her stance, as if she was ready to shield someone from harm. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She was protecting his mother from Victoria. "Where is my mother?" he asked, extricating himself from Victoria's arms more quickly than politeness demanded. "I expected to see her when I arrived." Victoria's smile flickered for just a moment before returning full force. "Oh, she's resting upstairs. She's been feeling a bit under the weather lately. Nothing serious, of course, but I've been taking such good care of her. Haven't I, Rose?" The way she said Rose's name made it sound like an insult. Watched as Rose's shoulders tensed slightly, but her voice remained steady when she answered. "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Elizabeth is resting comfortably. She was very excited about your homecoming, mister. She asked me to prepare your favorite meal for tonight." "How thoughtful," Victoria interjected quickly. "Though I'm afraid I had to correct the menu. Your tastes have probably changed during your time away, haven't they, darling? I've planned something more sophisticated for this evening, something more suitable for your new position in the company." Felt a chill run down his spine. His new position? He had been planning to return to his job at the family law firm, working alongside his stepfather as his mother had arranged. But Victoria's words suggested she had other plans, plans that apparently didn't require his input or consent. "I'd like to see my mother now," he said firmly, moving toward the staircase that led to the second floor. "We can discuss dinner plans later." "Oh, but she's sleeping," Victoria said quickly, moving to block his path. "The doctor said she shouldn't be disturbed. She's been having such a difficult time lately, and I've been doing everything I can to help her adjust to the changes. It's been quite challenging having to manage the household while she's been so fragile." The word fragile was loaded with implications that made blood boil. His mother had never been fragile. She had raised him alone after his father died unexpectedly of a heart attack, had managed the household and the family business with efficiency and grace. She had been the strongest person he knew, the rock that had held their small family together through every crisis. Rose stepped forward slightly, her voice quiet but clear. "Perhaps Mister would like some coffee while he gets settled. I could bring it to the den where it's more comfortable." It was a diplomatic suggestion, an attempt to diffuse the tension that was building in the room like storm clouds gathering before thunder. Appreciated the gesture, but he could see the way Victoria's eyes narrowed at what she clearly perceived as interference from someone who should know her place. "Rose," Victoria said, her voice carrying a warning that was barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of politeness. "I believe I asked you to polish the silver in the dining room. Perhaps you should attend to that now before you forget your other duties." The dismissal was clearly intended to remove Rose from the conversation, to prevent her from offering any more unwelcome assistance or observations. Watched as Rose's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she nodded with professional grace. "Of course, ma'am. Mister, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." As Rose moved toward the dining room, caught her eye for just a moment. In that brief exchange, he saw something that made his chest tighten with concern. It was fear, carefully hidden but unmistakable to someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of distress in hostile environments. Rose was afraid, not for herself, but for his mother. "Now then," Victoria said, sliding her arm through his and leading him toward the living room. "Let me tell you about all the wonderful changes I've made while you were away. I think you'll be so pleased with how I've improved things around here. It was really quite chaotic when I arrived, but I've managed to bring some order to the household." She guided him to his father's favorite leather armchair, the one where the old man had spent countless evenings reading case files and helping with his homework. The chair felt different now, as if it had been claimed by someone else's authority. Victoria settled herself on the arm of the chair, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder. "Your mother has been struggling with the adjustment," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a tone of practiced sympathy. "It's been very difficult for her having another woman in the house. I've tried to be patient, but there have been some incidents. Nothing too serious, but enough to make me concerned about her mental state." Felt his muscles tense beneath her touch. The implications in her words were clear. She was laying the groundwork for a narrative in which his mother was unstable, difficult, perhaps even unfit to make decisions about her own life. It was a classic manipulation tactic, one that would give Victoria more control over the household and ultimately over the family assets. What kind of incidents? He asked carefully, his voice betraying none of the anger that was building in his chest. Victoria sighed dramatically, her fingers tracing patterns on his shoulder that were probably meant to be comforting but felt more like the movements of a spider spinning a web. Oh, darling, it's been so hard to watch. She forgets things constantly, where she put her reading glasses, whether she's taken her medication, even conversations we had just hours before. And she's become so suspicious, accusing the staff of moving her belongings or stealing her jewelry. It's really quite sad. The picture Victoria was painting was so far from the sharp, organized woman who had raised him that almost laughed out loud. His mother had a memory like a steel trap and had never lost so much as a grocery list in her entire life. The idea that she would suddenly develop memory problems or paranoid delusions was ludicrous. But he also understood the insidious nature of Victoria's strategy. If she could establish that his mother was mentally declining, she could gradually take control of more aspects of the household. She could make decisions about his mother's care, about the management of the estate, about any number of things that would give her power and influence over the family's affairs. "I'd still like to see her," said, starting to rise from the chair. Victoria's hand pressed down more firmly on his shoulder, not enough to be obviously restraining, but enough to make her intent clear. "Of course, darling, but perhaps we should discuss a few things first. There have been some changes that might come as a shock if you're not prepared for them." The careful way she phrased the statement made alarm bells ring in his head. What kind of changes? What had been happening in this house while he was thousands of miles away, trusting that his family was safe and well cared for? From the dining room came the soft sound of silver being polished, a rhythmic whisper that somehow provided comfort in the growing tension of the conversation. Rose was still there, still working, still maintaining the household routines that had probably been his mother's small comfort in an increasingly difficult situation. "What changes?" asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Victoria's smile was triumphant, as if she had been waiting for this moment since the day he left. "Well, for one thing, your mother's relationship with the help has become quite inappropriate. She's developed an unhealthy attachment to Rose, treating her more like a friend than an employee. It's caused all sorts of problems with discipline and household management." The accusation was delivered with such confidence that almost wondered if he was missing something important. But then he remembered the scene he had witnessed when he arrived, Victoria berating Rose, and Rose's quiet, professional responses. There had been nothing inappropriate about the housekeeper's behavior. If anything, she had shown remarkable restraint in the face of obvious provocation. "I see," said carefully, "and what do you think should be done about this problem?" "Well, obviously we can't allow the situation to continue," Victoria said, her voice taking on a business-like efficiency that made his skin crawl. "I've been looking into some excellent care facilities where your mother would be much more comfortable. Places where she could receive proper medical attention and wouldn't have to worry about managing a household anymore." The casual way she discussed institutionalizing his mother left speechless for a moment. When he found his voice again, it came out harder than he intended. "My mother doesn't need to be in a care facility. She's not incapacitated." Victoria's laugh was bright and dismissive. "Oh, darling, I know it's hard to accept. You've been away, so you haven't seen the decline. But trust me, it's been quite dramatic. Just this morning, she couldn't remember whether she had eaten breakfast. And yesterday, she accused Rose of stealing her pearl necklace, then found it in her own jewelry box an hour later." Each anecdote was delivered with practiced sympathy, but could hear the calculation behind the words. Victoria had been building a case against his mother, collecting examples of supposed confusion or inappropriate behavior that would support her narrative of mental decline. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted his thoughts. Both he and Victoria turned to see his stepfather, Robert Henderson, descending into the living room. Robert was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had been his father's law partner and closest friend, and had always respected him. But now, seeing the man who had married his mother and allowed this situation to develop, felt a surge of disappointment and anger. Robert's face lit up with genuine pleasure as he crossed the room with his arms outstretched. "Welcome home, son. We've missed you terribly." The embrace was warm and sincere, and for a moment allowed himself to hope that perhaps things weren't as bad as they seemed. But when Robert stepped back, could see the strain in his face, the worry lines that had deepened since the wedding photos he had seen. "How is my mother?" asked directly, watching Robert's reaction carefully. Robert glanced quickly at Victoria, then back at, his expression becoming guarded. She's been having a difficult time adjusting to the changes. We're doing everything we can to help her, but it's been challenging. The careful neutrality of his response told everything he needed to know. Robert was either complicit in Victoria's plans or was too intimidated by his new wife to protect his mother properly. Either way, it meant that the two people who should have been looking after Elizabeth Williams' best interests had failed her completely. "I'd like to see her now," said firmly, this time making it clear that he wouldn't be deterred. "Of course," Robert said quickly. "She's in her room. She'll be so happy to see you." As moved toward the stairs, Victoria called after him. "Do try not to upset her, darling. She's been so fragile lately." The concern in her voice was perfectly pitched, but could hear the real message underneath. Don't believe anything she tells you. Don't listen to her side of the story. She's not mentally competent to give you accurate information about what's been happening here. Climbed the familiar stairs toward his mother's bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. Behind him, he could hear Victoria and Robert talking in low voices, but he couldn't make out the words. From the dining room, the soft sound of silver being polished continued, a steady rhythm that somehow promised that not everything in this house had been corrupted by Victoria's influence. At his mother's bedroom door, paused to collect himself. Whatever he found on the other side, he knew his life was about to change dramatically. The woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed Elizabeth Williams, lay propped up against a mountain of pillows in her king-sized bed, looking smaller and more fragile than had ever seen her. Her silver hair, once always perfectly styled, hung limp around her shoulders. Her face, though still beautiful at 62, was pale and drawn, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. But when she saw her son standing in the doorway, her entire face transformed with joy and relief. She whispered, tears immediately springing to her eyes. "Oh, my darling boy, you're really here." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and gathered her into his arms, shocked by how thin she had become. She felt bird-like in his embrace, as if she might break from too much pressure. The strong, capable woman who had been his rock through childhood and adolescence had been reduced to this fragile shell, and the sight of it filled him with rage and determination. "Mom," he said softly, settling onto the edge of the bed without releasing her. "I'm here now. Everything is going to be okay." She pulled back to look at his face, her hands trembling as she touched his cheeks. "You look so tired, sweetheart, and thin. Haven't they been feeding you properly over there?" Even in her weakened state, she was more concerned about his than her own. It was so typically her that felt his chest tighten with emotion. This was the mother he remembered, selfless, caring, always putting her family's needs before her own. "I'm fine, Mom, but what about you? Victoria says you've been feeling unwell." The mention of Victoria's name caused an immediate change in his mother's expression. Fear flickered across her features before she carefully composed herself, glancing toward the open bedroom door as if expecting his wife to appear at any moment. "I'm managing," she said quietly, but her eyes told a different story. "The doctors say I need more rest. Victoria has been very attentive to my needs." The pause before the word attentive spoke volumes. Gently closed the bedroom door, then returned to sit beside his mother. The action seemed to give her courage, and some of the tension left her shoulders. "Mom," he said carefully, "I want you to tell me the truth about what's been happening here. All of it." Elizabeth looked at her hands, twisted together in her lap. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and could see her internal struggle between the desire to protect him and the desperate need to confide in someone who might actually help her. "She wants me gone," Elizabeth finally whispered, so quietly that had to lean closer to hear her. "Victoria, she's been making my life miserable since the day Robert and I returned from our honeymoon. At first, she was subtle about it, little comments, small changes to household routines that made me feel unwelcome in my own home. But lately..." She trailed off, shaking her head, as if she couldn't find words for what she had endured. "Lately what, Mom?" "She's been telling everyone I'm losing my mind," Elizabeth said, her voice stronger now that she had broken the silence. "She hides my things, then acts concerned when I can't find them. She gives instructions to Rose and the other staff, then tells Robert and the doctor that I'm confused about household management. Yesterday, she locked me in here for 4 hours, claiming I was having an episode and needed to rest." Felt fury building in his chest like a wildfire. The systematic psychological torture his mother was describing was worse than anything he had imagined. Victoria wasn't just being difficult or demanding. She was deliberately trying to drive his mother to a breakdown. "Have you talked to Robert about this?" Elizabeth's laugh was bitter and heartbroken. "Robert sees what he wants to see. Victoria is very careful to be sweet and loving when he's around. She only shows her true nature when we're alone or when there are no witnesses who matter. And when I try to tell him what's happening, she's already laid the groundwork by suggesting I'm having memory problems or paranoid delusions." The calculated cruelty of Victoria's campaign was breathtaking in its sophistication. She had isolated his mother systematically, undermining her credibility while positioning herself as the long-suffering caregiver dealing with an increasingly difficult patient. "What about Rose? Doesn't she see what's happening?" "Rose tries to help when she can," Elizabeth said, and for the first time since he had arrived, heard real warmth in his mother's voice. "She's been wonderful, actually. Victoria treats her terribly, but Rose never complains. She just quietly does her job and tries to make things easier for me when Victoria isn't watching." Remembered the scene he had witnessed downstairs, the way Rose had stood with quiet dignity while Victoria berated her. The housekeeper's protective stance suddenly made complete sense. She was the only person in the house who truly understood what his mother was going through. "Why didn't you write to me about this? I would have come home immediately." Elizabeth looked guilty, as if she was confessing to some terrible crime. "Victoria reads my mail before it goes out. She says she's just trying to help me remember what I've written, but I know she's monitoring everything I say. The few letters that actually reached you were heavily edited. I tried to hint at the problems, but I was afraid that if I was too direct, she would stop letting me write at all." The revelation that Victoria had been censoring his mother's correspondence added another layer to her systematic campaign of isolation and control. Thought back to the cheerful, generic letters he had received during his deployment, remembering how different they had sounded from his mother's usual warm, detailed communications. He had attributed the change to the stress of her new marriage and his absence, never imagining that his wife was actively preventing his mother from reaching out for help. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Elizabeth immediately tensed, fear returning to her eyes. "Come in," called, though he was prepared to remove anyone who disturbed this crucial conversation. Rose entered carrying a tea tray, her movements careful and quiet. She had changed out of her work apron and into a simple brown cardigan, but her manner was still professionally deferential. "I thought you might like some tea, Mrs. Elizabeth," she said warmly. "I made chamomile the way you prefer it." "Thank you, Rose," Elizabeth said, and could hear genuine affection in her voice. "That's very thoughtful of you." Rose set the tray on the bedside table and began preparing the tea with practiced efficiency. Watched her careful movements and noticed the way she automatically adjusted the pillows behind his mother's back. Small gestures of care that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere professional duty. "Rose," said quietly, "could I speak with you for a moment?" She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected to be directly addressed by the man of the house. "Of course, sir. Should I come back later?" "No, please stay. I'd like to ask you about my mother's condition. You've been here through all of this." Rose glanced nervously at Elizabeth, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, sir. I've been working here for about 8 months now." "And in your opinion, how has my mother's health been?" The question clearly made Rose uncomfortable. She was being asked to comment on family matters that were technically none of her business, and could see her struggling with the boundaries of her professional position. "Rose," Elizabeth said gently, "it's all right, you can speak freely." Rose took a deep breath before answering. "Mrs. Elizabeth has been under a great deal of stress, sir. When I first started working here, she was energetic and involved in every aspect of household management. She knew exactly where everything was, remembered every appointment and social engagement, managed all the household accounts with perfect accuracy. And now she spends most of her time in this room. She seems tired all the time and worried about everything. But sir," Rose said, her voice becoming firmer, "there's nothing wrong with her mind. She remembers everything perfectly well when she's given the chance to think clearly. The confusion only happens when—" Rose stopped abruptly, realizing that she was about to criticize her employer's wife directly. "When what?" Pressed gently. Rose looked at Elizabeth again, seeking permission to continue. When his mother nodded, Rose squared her shoulders and spoke with quiet courage. When Mrs. Victoria is questioning her about things that have been moved or changed without Mrs. Elizabeth's knowledge. Yesterday, Mrs. Victoria asked your mother about a vase that was missing from the mantelpiece in the morning room. Mrs. Elizabeth couldn't find it, and Mrs. Victoria suggested she must have moved it and forgotten. But I had seen Mrs. Victoria put the vase in the storage closet the night before. The example was small but telling. Could imagine dozens of such incidents, each one designed to make his mother question her own memory and judgment. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one seemingly insignificant but collectively devastating to a person's confidence and sanity. Have there been other incidents like this? Rose nodded reluctantly. Many, sir. Items moved and then Mrs. Elizabeth blamed for losing them. Appointments changed without her knowledge, then she's told she must have confused the dates. Medical instructions altered, then she's criticized for not following them properly. Elizabeth reached out and took Rose's hand, a gesture of gratitude that spoke volumes about the relationship that had developed between them. In Rose, his mother had found not just an employee but an ally, someone who witnessed the truth and validated her experiences when everyone else was telling her she was losing her mind. Stood and began packing the room, his military training helping him analyze the situation tactically. Victoria had established a pattern of psychological warfare, systematically undermining his mother's confidence while building a case for her mental incompetence. The goal was clearly to gain control over the household and ultimately over his mother's assets and decision-making authority. How long has this been going on? It started almost immediately after the wedding, Elizabeth said. At first, I thought it was just the normal adjustment period of two women learning to share a household, but it became clear very quickly that Victoria had no intention of sharing anything. She wanted complete control, and she was willing to destroy my peace of mind to get it. Stopped packing and turned to face both women. Why hasn't Robert intervened? Surely he must see some of what's happening. Elizabeth's expression became deeply sad. Robert is a good man, but he's not equipped to handle this kind of manipulation. Victoria is very careful to present herself as the perfect wife when he's around. She's loving and attentive to him, concerned and helpful with me. When I try to tell him what really happens, she's already planted seeds of doubt about my mental state. Rose cleared her throat softly. If I may, sir, Mr. Robert works very long hours at the law firm. He leaves early in the morning and doesn't return until evening. Most of the incidents happen during the day when he's not here to witness them. The picture that was emerging was of a woman isolated in her own home, surrounded by people who either couldn't or wouldn't protect her from systematic abuse. The only person who truly understood what she was experiencing was the housekeeper who had been hired to help her, but had instead become her sole advocate and defender. What about the other staff? Are there other people working here who could corroborate what you've witnessed? Rose shook her head. Mrs. Victoria dismissed most of the previous staff shortly after the wedding. She said they were too set in their old ways and needed to be replaced with people who understood her standards. I'm the only one who has been here long enough to see the pattern. The systematic replacement of staff was another classic control tactic. By removing people who had loyalty to his mother and replacing them with employees who owed their positions to Victoria, his wife had eliminated potential witnesses and allies. Rose said carefully, I need to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly. Are you afraid of Victoria? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Rose looked down at her hands, then met eyes with quiet determination. Yes, sir, I am afraid of her. Not for myself exactly, but for what she might do to Mrs. Elizabeth if I'm not here to help. And I'm afraid that if I speak out too strongly, she'll find a reason to dismiss me, and then Mrs. Elizabeth will have no one. The admission was delivered with such honest courage that felt a surge of respect for this woman who was risking her livelihood to protect his mother. Rose had recognized the impossible position she was in, speak out and lose her job, or stay silent and watch his mother suffer. She had chosen a middle path, providing what protection she could while carefully documenting what she witnessed. Has she threatened to dismiss you? Several times, Rose said quietly. Usually after I've tried to help Mrs. Elizabeth with something Mrs. Victoria didn't approve of. She reminds me regularly that household staff positions are easy to fill and that she expects complete loyalty to her rather than to previous arrangements. Felt his anger building again, but this time it was focused and controlled. Victoria had created a reign of terror in his childhood home, systematically destroying his mother's peace of mind while intimidating anyone who might speak out on her behalf. The psychological sophistication of her campaign suggested this wasn't impulsive cruelty, but carefully planned abuse designed to achieve specific goals. "Mom," he said, returning to sit beside his mother, "I need you to think carefully about something. Has Victoria ever suggested specific solutions to your supposed health problems? Has she recommended doctors, treatments, or living arrangements?" Elizabeth nodded immediately. "Oh yes, she's been very helpful with suggestions. She found a new doctor who specializes in elderly care, and she's been researching residential facilities that she thinks would be perfect for someone in my condition. She even took me to visit one last week, Serenity Manor, about an hour from here. Very expensive, very exclusive." The pieces of Victoria's plan were falling into place with chilling clarity. She wasn't just tormenting his mother for the sake of cruelty. She was building toward a specific outcome. By establishing his mother as mentally incompetent, she could then present institutionalization as the logical, caring solution. Once his mother was safely removed from the household, Victoria would have complete control over Robert, the house, and any family assets she could access. "What did you think of this facility?" "It was beautiful," Elizabeth admitted. "Clean, well-staffed, with lovely gardens, but the people there were truly ill. Dementia patients, stroke victims, people who really couldn't care for themselves. I don't belong there, and I don't want to spend my remaining years locked away from my family and friends." Rose spoke up quietly. "Mrs. Elizabeth asked me to research the facility online. The fees are over $8,000 per month, and once a resident is admitted, they require a minimum stay of 6 months before any change in living arrangements can be considered." The financial implications were staggering. $8,000 a month would quickly drain a substantial portion of his mother's assets, money that would go directly to the facility while Victoria remained in control of the family home and other resources. Stood again, his mind racing through possible responses and solutions. He was facing an enemy who had been preparing for months, who had carefully planned every move and anticipated most forms of resistance. But Victoria had made one crucial mistake. She had assumed he would return home as the same naive young man who had left for deployment 3 years ago. Military service had taught him about psychological warfare, about reading enemy intentions and developing counter-strategies. More importantly, it had taught him about loyalty, duty, and the absolute necessity of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "I want you both to listen to me carefully," he said, his voice taking on the command authority he had learned in the service. "This ends now. I don't know exactly how yet, but Victoria's campaign against this family is over as of today." Elizabeth looked hopeful but frightened. "Be careful. She's very clever, and she has Robert completely convinced that she's trying to help. If you confront her directly, she'll find a way to make you look like the unreasonable one." "Then I won't confront her directly," said grimly. "I'll be smarter than that. Rose, I need your help with something, and I need to know that I can trust you completely." Rose straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze steadily. "You can trust me, sir. Mrs. Elizabeth has been nothing but kind to me, and I won't stand by and watch her be destroyed by someone who doesn't deserve to share the same roof with her." The fierce loyalty in Rose's voice reminded of the bonds he had formed with fellow soldiers who had proven themselves under fire. This woman had been fighting for his mother's for months, armed with nothing but courage and compassion. Now it was time to even the odds. "Good," said, "because we're going to need evidence, real, documented proof of what Victoria has been doing. And we're going to need to be very careful about how we gather it because she's already shown that she's ruthless when it comes to protecting her position." Outside the bedroom door, the house was quiet except for the sound of distant conversation from the living room below. Victoria and Robert were probably discussing his homecoming, perhaps planning how to present their version of his mother's condition when he returned downstairs. They had no idea that the war they thought they were winning was about to take a very different turn. Looked at his mother and Rose, 2 women who had been under siege for months, and felt the familiar surge of protective determination that had served him well in combat zones. Victoria had chosen the wrong family to manipulate, and she had made the fatal error of underestimating the bonds of loyalty and love that connected the people she was trying to destroy. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn sunshine that made the old house on Elm Street look like something from a magazine. had spent a restless night in his childhood bedroom, formulating plans and analyzing Victoria's tactics from every angle. He had learned in the military that the best defense against psychological warfare was methodical documentation and strategic patience. Victoria had been building her case against his mother for months. He would need to be equally systematic in building his countercase. At 7:30, he made his way downstairs to find Rose already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with quiet efficiency. She looked up when he entered, her expression cautious but hopeful. "Good morning, mister. Would you like coffee?" "Please," he settled at the kitchen table, appreciating the familiar comfort of the room where he had eaten countless meals as a child. "Rose, I want to discuss what we talked about yesterday." She poured coffee into a heavy ceramic mug and set it before him, then remained standing with her hands folded in front of her. The formal posture reminded him that despite their alliance, she was still navigating the delicate boundaries of her position as household staff. "Sit down," he said gently. "We're going to be working together on this, which means we need to be able to speak freely." Rose hesitated for a moment, then took the chair across from him. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to start keeping a record of everything Victoria does or says that relates to my mother. Dates, times, witnesses present, exact words when possible. Can you do that without arousing suspicion?" "Yes, sir. I've actually been doing something like that already, though not as formally as you're describing." Felt a surge of respect for the woman's foresight. "You have. Where do you keep these records?" Rose stood and moved to a small desk in the corner of the kitchen. From the bottom drawer, she retrieved a composition notebook with a worn blue cover. "I started writing things down about 2 months ago when the incidents became more frequent and more serious. I thought that if something terrible happened to Mrs. Elizabeth, someone should know the truth about what led up to it." She handed him the notebook and opened it to find pages of careful handwriting, each entry dated and meticulously detailed. Rose had documented everything from Victoria's verbal abuse to specific instances of items being moved and his mother being blamed for the confusion. The entries painted a clear picture of systematic psychological torture that would be compelling evidence in any formal proceeding. "This is excellent work, Rose, much more detailed than I expected." A flush of pride colored her cheeks. "I worked as a secretary before I took this job. I'm used to keeping accurate records." Continued reading, impressed by the thoroughness of Rose's observations. She had noted not only Victoria's actions, but also his mother's responses, the presence or absence of witnesses, and even weather conditions that might affect his mother's mood or energy levels. The picture that emerged was of a woman under constant stress, responding to genuine persecution rather than suffering from imaginary problems. "There's something else," Rose said quietly. "Yesterday, after you arrived, Mrs. Victoria made several phone calls. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to know she was talking to someone about accelerating plans for Mrs. Elizabeth's placement at Serenity Manor." The news hit like a physical blow. Victoria was moving faster than he had anticipated, probably motivated by his unexpected return. If she could get his mother committed to the facility quickly enough, it would be much more difficult to reverse the situation later. "Did you hear any specifics, dates, arrangements?" "She mentioned something about having the paperwork ready by the end of the week, and she talked about having doctor complete a evaluation as soon as possible." Closed the notebook and handed it back to Rose. "I need you to hide this somewhere very secure, and I need you to continue documenting everything. But Rose, you have to be incredibly careful. If Victoria discovers what you're doing, she'll find a way to dismiss you immediately, and we'll lose our best source of information." "I understand, sir. I've been careful so far." The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Rose immediately herself at the stove while opened a newspaper, both of them assuming casual positions as Victoria entered the kitchen. She was dressed in a silk robe and designer slippers, her hair and makeup already perfect despite the early hour. "Good morning, darling," she said, moving to kiss on the cheek. "You're up early. I hope the bed was comfortable. I had Rose put fresh linens on everything yesterday." "Thank you, it was fine." Accepted the kiss but didn't return it, keeping his attention focused on the newspaper. Victoria settled at the table with a cup of coffee that Rose provided without being asked. "I thought we might spend the day together, just the two of us. There's so much to catch up on, and I have some wonderful ideas about our future that I think you'll find exciting." The possessive way she said "our future" made skin crawl, but he kept his expression neutral. "Actually, I was hoping to spend time with my mother today. We barely had a chance to talk yesterday." Victoria's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Oh, of course. But you know, she's been having some difficulty with extended conversations lately. The doctor thinks too much stimulation might be counterproductive for her condition." "What condition exactly?" asked, setting down the newspaper and looking directly at his wife. "Well, the early stages of dementia, obviously. Doctor has been very clear about the progression we can expect. It's heartbreaking, really, but we have to face reality." The casual way she announced his mother's supposed diagnosis was breathtaking in its audacity. Had to remind himself to maintain his cover of ignorance for now. "Dementia, that seems very sudden. She was fine when I left." "These things can progress quickly at her age," Victoria said with practiced sympathy. "The stress of adjusting to a new marriage, your absence, the changes in household routine, it all contributed to accelerating the symptoms. But don't worry, darling. I've been taking excellent care of her, and I've found the perfect place where she can receive professional care." Rose's movements at the stove became very careful and controlled, and could sense her tension even without looking at her directly. Victoria was laying out her entire plan with complete confidence, apparently convinced that would accept her narrative without question. "Have you gotten a second opinion on this diagnosis?" Victoria's pause was so brief that someone not watching for it would have missed it entirely. "Doctor is one of the most respected geriatricians in the city. I don't think a second opinion is necessary, and it would only be traumatic for your mother to go through more testing." "I'd like to speak with Doctor myself." "Of course, darling, I'll arrange a meeting. But in the meantime, I really think you should prepare yourself for what you're going to see. Your mother isn't the woman you remember. The confusion, the paranoid thoughts, the inability to manage simple tasks, it's all very advanced now." Stood abruptly, needing to end the conversation before his anger became visible. "I think I'll go check on her now." "She's probably still sleeping," Victoria said quickly. "She's been having terrible insomnia, so the doctor prescribed sleeping medication. She shouldn't be disturbed before 10 o'clock at the earliest." The casual mention of sleeping medication triggered alarm bells in his mind. If Victoria was controlling his mother's medication, she could be using it to keep her sedated and confused, making the symptoms of mental decline more convincing to outside observers. "I'll just look in on her quietly," said, already moving toward the stairs. "Wait," Victoria's voice carried a note of command that she quickly softened. "There's something else we need to discuss, about Rose." Stopped and turned back, aware that Rose was now completely motionless at the stove, every line of her body tense with apprehension. "What about Rose?" "Well, it's become clear that the relationship between Rose and your mother has become problematic. Your mother has become quite dependent on Rose, which isn't healthy for either of them. I think it would be best if we made a change in staffing arrangements." The euphemism was clear. Victoria wanted to fire Rose, eliminating the only witness to her campaign against his mother. Felt his strategic planning shift into higher gear. He needed to protect Rose's position while avoiding a direct confrontation that would reveal his knowledge of the situation. "Rose seems competent enough to me," he said carefully. "What specific problems have you observed?" Victoria glanced at Rose, who was now facing them with carefully controlled features. "It's not a matter of competence. It's about appropriate boundaries. Rose has been encouraging your mother's fantasies. When your mother makes confused or paranoid statements, Rose tends to validate them rather than gently redirecting her toward reality." The accusation was delivered with such apparent sincerity that had to admire Victoria's skill as a manipulator. She was essentially blaming Rose for refusing to gaslight his mother, but she framed it as enabling delusions rather than supporting truth. "I see," said, "and what would you suggest as an alternative?" "I've identified an excellent agency that specializes in care for patients with dementia. They would provide trained staff who understand how to manage confusion and paranoid episodes without reinforcing them." Could see the entire picture now. Remove Rose, bring in staff loyal to Victoria, accelerate his mother's supposed decline, and complete the process of institutionalization. It was a comprehensive plan that would give Victoria everything she wanted while appearing to be motivated by genuine concern for his mother's. "That's a significant change," said. "I'd like to think about it." Victoria's smile was triumphant. "Of course, darling, but we shouldn't wait too long. The situation is becoming more difficult every day, and I'm concerned about the stress it's placing on Rose as well. It's not fair to ask her to manage a situation she's not trained to handle." The false concern for Rose's was the finishing touch on Victoria's performance. She had managed to present herself as considerate of everyone involved while systematically destroying the support system that kept his mother functional and protected. Excused himself and headed upstairs, his mind working furiously to adjust his strategy. Victoria was moving faster than he had anticipated, and the window for gathering evidence and building a case was rapidly closing. He needed to accelerate his own timeline while maintaining the appearance of a concerned but confused son who was slowly accepting his wife's version of reality. At his mother's door, he knocked softly and waited for permission to enter. Elizabeth was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than she had the previous day. Rose had obviously managed to bring her breakfast and medication without Victoria's interference. "Good morning, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, her voice stronger and more focused than it had been yesterday. "You look troubled. Is everything all right?" Settled into the chair beside her bed, struck again by how mentally sharp his mother was when she wasn't being actively manipulated and confused by Victoria's games. "Mom, I need to ask you about your medication. What exactly are you taking, and who is managing your prescriptions?" Elizabeth looked uncertain. "Doctor prescribed several things, something for sleep, something for anxiety, and vitamins. Victoria manages all of it for me. She says it's too easy for someone my age to make mistakes with dosages and timing." "Do you know what the medications are called?" "No, I'm afraid not. Victoria removes all the labels and puts everything in a weekly pill organizer for me. She says it's safer that way, less confusing." The practice of removing labels was another red flag. By controlling his mother's access to information about her own medication, Victoria could be administering anything from excessive sedatives to drugs that would actually cause confusion and memory problems. "Mom, I want you to do something for me, and it's very important. The next time Victoria gives you medication, I want you to ask to see the original bottles. Tell her you want to understand what you're taking and why." Elizabeth looked frightened. "That will make her very angry. She gets upset when I ask questions about my care. She says it shows I don't trust her judgment." "I know it's difficult, but I need you to do this. If she refuses or becomes angry, that's important information for me to have." Elizabeth nodded reluctantly. "All right, but please be careful. Victoria is much more dangerous than she appears. She's very good at making people believe that anyone who questions her is the one with the problem." The warning reinforced what had already observed about Victoria's sophisticated manipulation tactics. She had managed to position herself as the reasonable, caring person dealing with difficult people who were either mentally incompetent or unreasonably hostile to her help. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Rose entered quietly, carrying a small vase with fresh flowers from the garden. "I thought these might brighten your morning, Mrs. Elizabeth," Rose said, setting the vase on the bedside table. "They're beautiful, Rose. Thank you." Elizabeth's face lit up with genuine pleasure at the simple gesture. Watched the interaction between his mother and the housekeeper, nodding the easy affection and mutual respect that characterized their relationship. This wasn't the unhealthy dependency that Victoria described. It was a normal friendship between two women who had found support in each other during a difficult time. "Rose said quietly, "Could you show me where the medication is kept? I'd like to understand my mother's care routine." Rose glanced nervously between and Elizabeth. "Mrs. Victoria keeps all the medications locked in the cabinet in the master bathroom. She says it's safer that way to prevent accidental overdoses." Another control mechanism. By locking away the medications, Victoria ensured that no one else could verify what his mother was actually being given or check the prescribed dosages against what she was receiving. "Does she give the medication at the same time every day?" "Yes, sir. 8 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 8 in the evening. She's very particular about the timing." The rigid schedule and Victoria's personal involvement in every dose suggested that medication management was a crucial part of her strategy. If she was using drugs to keep his mother confused and sedated, she would need to maintain strict control over the timing and dosages. Stood and moved to the window, looking down at the garden where his father had taught him to throw a baseball, and his mother had grown prize-winning roses. The normalcy of the scene was in stark contrast to the psychological warfare being conducted inside the house. "Mom," he said, turning back to face her, "I want you to start feeling hopeful. Things are going to change, and they're going to change soon. But I need you to be patient a little longer and continue being careful about what you say and do around Victoria." "Are you going to confront her directly?" "Not yet. I'm going to be smarter than that. Victoria thinks she's dealing with the same young man who left here 3 years ago, but she's wrong. I've learned a few things about strategy and patience, and I'm going to use every advantage I can get." Elizabeth reached for his hand, squeezing it with more strength than he had felt from her since his return. "I've been so frightened, not just for myself, but for what this situation might do to you and Robert. Victoria is very good at turning people against each other." "She won't turn me against you, Mom, and when this is over, she won't be able to hurt you anymore." Rose cleared her throat softly. "Mister, I should mention that Mrs. Victoria has scheduled a meeting with Doctor for tomorrow afternoon. She told me to make sure Mrs. Elizabeth is well rested beforehand." The news accelerated sense of urgency. If Victoria was pushing for another medical evaluation, she was probably planning to use it to finalize the institutionalization process. He needed to move faster while still maintaining his cover of gradual awareness rather than immediate understanding of the situation. "Thank you for letting me know, Rose. I think I'd like to attend that meeting as well." Rose looked uncertain. "I'm not sure Mrs. Victoria is planning for you to be included. She mentioned that too many people in the room might be overwhelming for Mrs. Elizabeth." "I'm sure she'll understand my desire to be involved in my mother's medical care," said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The confrontation had been preparing for came sooner than expected. He was in the study reviewing some of his father's old legal books when he heard raised voices from the kitchen. Victoria's sharp tone cut through the quiet afternoon air, followed by Rose's softer voice attempting to explain something. Moved quickly through the house, arriving at the kitchen doorway just in time to witness a scene that crystallized everything he needed to understand about the dynamic in his family home. Victoria stood in the center of the kitchen, holding a small glass vial in her raised hand, her face flushed with anger and indignation. Rose stood near the sink, her shoulders squared but her face pale with fear and determination. Between them on the kitchen counter were scattered the contents of what appeared to be his mother's evening medications, various pills separated into small piles. "How dare you go through Mrs. Williams' private medical supplies?" Victoria was saying, her voice deadly quiet with controlled rage. "This is a complete violation of trust and professional boundaries. I cannot have household staff taking it upon themselves to second-guess medical decisions." Rose's voice was steady despite the obvious threat in Victoria's manner. "I was organizing the medications as you requested, Mrs. Victoria, but some of these pills don't match the descriptions on the bottles. This one," she pointed to a small white pill, "is supposed to be Mrs. Elizabeth's calcium supplement according to the label, but it's clearly a different medication." Stepped into the kitchen before Victoria could respond. "What's going on here?" Both women turned toward him, their expressions revealing their different concerns. Victoria's face showed annoyance at the interruption, while Rose's showed relief at the arrival of potential support. "Just a small misunderstanding," Victoria said quickly, moving to gather the scattered pills back into their container. "Rose was helping me organize your mother's medications, and there was some confusion about the labeling system." Rose remained silent, but could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to speak, but was clearly aware that direct contradiction of Victoria's explanation could cost her job and eliminate his mother's only protection. "May I see the medications?" asked, his tone casual but firm. Victoria hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing over the pill organizer and several prescription bottles. "Of course, though I should mention that the organization system might seem confusing if you're not familiar with medical management." Examined the bottles carefully, noting immediately that most of the original pharmacy labels had been removed or covered with Victoria's own handwritten labels. The few original labels that remained were for medications he didn't recognize, drugs with names that suggested psychiatric or neurological applications, rather than the vitamins and mild anxiety medication Victoria had described. "This one is interesting," said, holding up a bottle labeled haloperidol. "I'm not familiar with this medication. What is it prescribed for?" Victoria's carefully composed expression flickered with uncertainty. It's for anxiety. Doctor prescribed it specifically for your mother's condition." Rose made a small sound that might have been a stifled gasp, but when looked at her, she had turned back to the sink and was busying herself with dishes. Had learned enough about psychological medications during his military service to recognize haloperidol as a powerful antipsychotic drug, typically used for severe mental illness or to control violent behavior. It was definitely not a medication prescribed for simple anxiety or age-related memory issues. "And this one?" He held up another bottle labeled lorazepam. "Also for anxiety," Victoria said quickly. "Your mother has been having severe panic attacks, and this helps keep her calm." Knew that lorazepam was indeed used for anxiety, but in the doses indicated on the bottle, it would cause significant sedation and cognitive impairment. Combined with the haloperidol, the medication regimen would essentially render his mother mentally incapacitated for most of each day. "These seem like very strong medications for someone with mild dementia symptoms," observed, keeping his tone neutral. "Doctor believes in aggressive early intervention," Victoria replied. "The idea is to prevent the condition from worsening by managing the symptoms before they become severe." The explanation was smooth and confident, but could see the calculation behind Victoria's eyes. She was gauging his reaction, trying to determine how much he believed and how much he might question. "I'd like to speak with doctor about my mother's treatment plan," said. "Could you arrange a meeting for this week?" "I already told you that I would arrange something," Victoria said, a note of irritation creeping into her voice. "But you have to understand that too much interference from family members can actually be counterproductive for the patient. Doctor prefers to work directly with the primary caregiver to avoid confusing or conflicting messages." The suggestion that his involvement would be harmful to his mother was breathtaking in its audacity, but recognized it as another classic manipulation tactic. By positioning herself as the only person qualified to make decisions about his mother's care, Victoria was systematically excluding everyone else from the process. "I'm sure doctor will understand my concern as her son," said firmly. "I'll call his office myself to schedule an appointment." Victoria's smile became strained. "Of course, darling, but please coordinate with me so we don't create scheduling conflicts." Rose had finished with the dishes and was quietly preparing to leave the kitchen when Victoria suddenly turned her attention back to the housekeeper. "Rose, I think it would be best if you avoided handling Mrs. Williams' medications in the future. That type of medical management should be left to family members or trained medical personnel." The dismissal was clearly intended to prevent Rose from observing or questioning the medication regimen in the future. Realized this might be his only opportunity to establish Rose's right to remain involved in his mother's care. "Actually, I think Rose should continue helping with the medications," said calmly. "Having an additional person involved reduces the chance of errors, and Rose has shown herself to be very careful and observant." Victoria's face showed genuine surprise at the direct contradiction of her wishes. "I really don't think that's appropriate. Rose isn't trained in medical care, and there are liability issues to consider." Rose said, ignoring Victoria's objection, "I'd like you to help me understand my mother's daily routine. Could you walk me through exactly what medications she receives and when?" Rose glanced nervously at Victoria before answering. "Mrs. Elizabeth receives medications 3 times a day, sir. Morning medications include 2 white pills and 1 blue capsule. Afternoon medications include 1 white pill and 1 yellow tablet. Evening medications include 2 white pills, 1 blue capsule, and 1 pink tablet." The clinical precision of Rose's answer made it clear that she had been paying careful attention to the medication routine, probably documenting it as part of her ongoing record-keeping. Victoria stepped forward quickly. "Rose, that's not quite accurate. You're confusing some of the dosages and timing." "Actually," Rose said with quiet determination, "I've been keeping careful track because I was concerned about potential interactions. Mrs. Elizabeth has been showing signs of oversedation, especially in the afternoons and evenings." The direct challenge to Victoria's management was clearly not what the housekeeper had planned to say, but's presence seemed to have given her courage to speak more freely about her observations. Oversedation? Asked, looking directly at Victoria. Rose isn't qualified to assess medication effects, Victoria said quickly. What she's interpreting as oversedation is actually just the natural fatigue that comes with your mother's condition. The medications are helping to manage her anxiety and confusion. Turned back to Rose. What specific signs have you observed? Rose looked at Victoria, then back at, clearly weighing the professional risks of her answer against her concern for his mother's. Mrs. Elizabeth has difficulty staying awake during conversations, sir. She often falls asleep in the middle of activities she used to enjoy, like reading or working in the garden. Her speech is sometimes slurred, and her coordination is affected. Yesterday, she couldn't hold a coffee cup steady enough to drink from it. The symptoms Rose described were classic signs of medication-induced cognitive impairment, not natural progression of dementia. Felt his anger building, but he kept his expression neutral. These are concerning symptoms, he said. I think we definitely need to review the medication regimen with Doctor. Victoria's composure was beginning to crack slightly. I really wish you would trust my judgment on this. I've been managing your mother's care for months now, and I have a much better understanding of her needs than someone who has just returned home. The implied criticism stung, but recognized it as another manipulation tactic, making him feel guilty for his absence while positioning Victoria as the long-suffering caregiver who deserved automatic deference. I'm sure you've been doing your best, said diplomatically, but as her son, I have a responsibility to be involved in major medical decisions. Of course, Victoria said, but her tone suggested anything but agreement. I just hope you'll be careful not to disrupt the progress we've made in stabilizing her condition. Noticed Rose watching the exchange with careful attention, and he could see her making mental notes of everything that was being said. Her documentation would be crucial if this situation escalated to legal proceedings. Rose said, I'd like you to prepare a written summary of my mother's daily routine, including meals, activities, and medication times. Could you have that ready for me by tomorrow? Yes, sir, Rose said immediately. Victoria's objection was swift. I don't think that's necessary. I already have comprehensive records of your mother's care. I'm sure you do, replied. But I'd like Rose's perspective as well. Sometimes different observers notice different details. The request clearly made Victoria uncomfortable, but she couldn't object too strongly without seeming unreasonably controlling. Was beginning to establish a pattern of reasonable requests that would be difficult for her to refuse without revealing her true motives. Fine, Victoria said with forced cheerfulness. Though I hope you understand that Rose's observations might not be entirely reliable. She doesn't have the medical background to interpret what she sees accurately. The constant undermining of Rose's credibility was another element of Victoria's strategy, systematically discrediting anyone who might contradict her narrative about his mother's condition. Spent the rest of the afternoon quietly observing the household routine, noting the interactions between all the family members and staff. What he saw confirmed everything Rose had documented and everything his mother had told him. Victoria maintained perfect behavior when Robert was present, but her treatment of both his mother and Rose became subtly cruel whenever she believed she was unobserved. That evening, waited until Victoria was occupied with phone calls before slipping up to his mother's room. Elizabeth was sitting in her chair by the window, looking more alert than she had since his return. How are you feeling, Mom? Much better today, Elizabeth said with a smile that was brighter than any he had seen since coming home. Rose helped me cut back on the afternoon medication. She said you had asked her to monitor my routine more carefully. The improvement in his mother's condition after reducing just one dose of medication was dramatic evidence of the oversedation Rose had identified. Felt a surge of gratitude toward the housekeeper who had risked her job to help his mother. Mom, I need to tell you something important. I'm going to confront Victoria directly about the medication and about her treatment of you. But before I do that, I want to make sure you're prepared for what might happen. Elizabeth reached for his hand. What do you mean? Victoria is going to fight back, and she's going to try to make you and everyone else believe that I'm the one who's being unreasonable. She might even try to have you committed to that facility before I can stop her." Fear flickered across his mother's face, but it was mixed with determination. "What can I do to help?" "Be ready to speak up for yourself when the time comes. Don't let anyone convince you that you're confused or incompetent. Trust your own perceptions, and don't be afraid to contradict Victoria directly if necessary." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "I can do that. I've been silent for too long trying to keep the peace. It's time I stood up for myself." As prepared for bed that night, he reviewed his strategy for the direct confrontation that would come soon. Victoria had built her position carefully over months, but she had also made crucial mistakes. She had underestimated his mother's mental strength. She had failed to completely silence Rose, and most importantly, she had assumed that would accept her narrative without conducting his own investigation. Tomorrow would bring the meeting with Doctor, and suspected that encounter would provide the final pieces of evidence he needed to expose Victoria's systematic abuse. The war for his mother's freedom was about to reach its climactic battle, and was confident that truth and justice would finally prevail over manipulation and cruelty. The house settled into quiet as everyone prepared for sleep, but knew that for him, this would be another sleepless night of planning and preparation. Too much was at stake to leave anything to chance, and Victoria had proven herself to be a formidable adversary who would fight viciously to protect her position. But she had made one fatal error. She had targeted the wrong family, and she was about to discover that some bonds of love and loyalty could not be broken by even the most sophisticated. The meeting with Doctor took place in his downtown office on a gray Thursday afternoon that seemed to match the gravity of the situation. Arrived early, and positioned himself strategically in the waiting room where he could observe Victoria's behavior before she knew he was present. What he witnessed confirmed his worst suspicions about the depth of her deception. Victoria sat in the corner chair, speaking quietly into her phone with the kind of intimate tone that suggested a very personal conversation. Caught fragments of her words, phrases about accelerating the timeline, and completing the paperwork before any interference. When she ended the call and noticed watching her, her expression shifted instantly to the mask of concerned wife and devoted daughter-in-law he had come to recognize. "Darling," she said, rising to greet him with a kiss on the cheek. "I'm so glad you decided to come. Doctor has been such a wonderful support through this difficult time." She had positioned herself between and the reception desk, clearly intending to control the flow of information during the appointment, but had spent the morning doing his own research on Doctor, and what he had discovered was deeply troubling. Doctor had been disciplined twice by the state medical board for questionable practices related to elderly care, including inappropriate medication prescribing and hasty evaluations that had resulted in premature institutionalizations. Most damning of all, he held a financial interest in Serenity Manor, the expensive care facility Victoria had been promoting as the perfect solution for his mother's supposed condition. When they were called into Doctor's office, immediately understood why Victoria had chosen this particular physician. Doctor was a thin, nervous man in his 50s whose entire demeanor suggested someone more interested in processing patients quickly than in providing careful, individualized care. His office was cluttered with pharmaceutical company promotional materials and brochures for various care facilities. "Mr. Williams," Doctor said, barely looking up from a file on his desk, "your wife has been keeping me updated on your mother's condition. I understand you have some concerns about our treatment approach." The assumption that Victoria was his primary source of information was the first red flag. A competent physician would want to hear directly from family members, not rely exclusively on one person's interpretation of symptoms and behavior. "I have several concerns," said carefully. "First, I'd like to understand the basis for my mother's diagnosis. What specific tests or evaluations led you to conclude she has dementia?" Doctor glanced at Victoria before consulting his file. "Well, the diagnosis is based primarily on observed behaviors and reported symptoms. Your wife has been very thorough in documenting episodes of confusion, memory loss, and inappropriate responses to routine situations." "What about cognitive testing, brain scans, blood work to rule out other conditions?" The questions clearly made Doctor uncomfortable. Those types of extensive evaluations are often unnecessary when the behavioral evidence is so clear. We prefer to avoid putting elderly patients through traumatic testing procedures when the diagnosis is obvious. felt his anger building at the cavalier dismissal of proper diagnostic procedures. "Doctor, I've reviewed my mother's medication regimen, and I have serious concerns about the dosages and drug combinations you've prescribed." Victoria interjected quickly. "Doctor is the expert here. I think we should trust his professional judgment." "Actually," continued, ignoring his wife's interruption, "I'd like to know why my mother is being given haloperidol. That seems like an unusually strong medication for someone with mild cognitive symptoms." Doctor's discomfort became more obvious. "The haloperidol is necessary to manage aggressive episodes. Your mother has been displaying some concerning behavioral changes that require intervention." "Aggressive episodes?" His voice sharpened. "Could you be more specific about these incidents?" Doctor looked at Victoria, who nodded encouragingly. "According to your wife's reports, your mother has become increasingly hostile toward household staff, has made paranoid accusations about theft and harassment, and has physically resisted care on several occasions." Every word Doctor spoke was a revelation of how completely Victoria had manipulated the medical narrative. She had taken his mother's warfare. As he left his mother's room and headed back downstairs, was already formulating the next phase of his strategy. Victoria had made the mistake of assuming he would accept her narrative without question, but she was about to learn that her careful plans were about to encounter significant resistance from someone who understood exactly what she was doing and why. The battle for his mother's freedom and dignity was about to begin in earnesto, much to give him opportunities and education, was depending on him to see through whatever deception had been woven around her. He knocked softly and heard his mother's voice, weaker than he remembered but still unmistakably hers, inviting him to enter. When he opened the door, the sight that greeted him confirmed his worst fears and set the stage for the confrontation that would determine the future of everyone in the house on Elm Street.